Okay, I'd like to welcome you today to the beginning of our spring seminar series on sustainability. This semester, we're going to focus on social science research and aspects of sustainability, a little different from our other focuses the past couple years. But we wanted to examine social research, how it can help us understand the different types of people, how they relate to current environmental challenges, examine studies on consumer choices and environmental impact of their decisions, and see the overlap of environmental and social justice concerns that need to be addressed. So we want to recognize that research about people's values, attitudes, and behavior is vital to our understanding what drives the change for sustainability and getting people to adapt to those changes. So today we have with us Dr. Steve Seitz, who's director of the U of I Computational Modeling Lab for LAS, and he's also associate professor of political science here at the U of I. He was the PI for the U.S. model, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, computer simulation model. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1972 and his bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. Steve's research interests are in computational modeling, public policy, and political thought. So today he'll weave those together for us in his presentation. And I also wanted to let you know our upcoming talks. I have a sheet there for our next week. We have a talk on biochar and heavy metals absorption. For those interested, that's February 2nd. And our next sustainability talk will be February 22nd. It'll actually be a webinar from 1 to 2:30 that day. I'll send out announcements on that. And if you haven't signed up for my email list, please sign up, and then you'll start getting lots of emails from me. But that will be a webinar on Go Green initiative that the Field Museum is doing with libraries throughout the state and how they can help communities begin other green projects in their cities. So that should be an interesting webinar that day if you can join us. So, Steve, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. The materials that I'm going to cover really focus mostly on policy formation, and the relationship between attitudes of the public, or how it is that the public is involved in this process and perhaps not involved in the process, as the case may be. Social sciences, as you probably know, are a very, very diverse area, and there are a variety of different approaches. So I'm not representing all of them. I'm actually representing a very particular strand that crosses between the social sciences and the harder sciences. So the materials that we particularly work on would involve very complex modeling. In the case of the IWG/AIDS program, for example, this is the standard now model for understanding the transmission of HIV/AIDS in any environment, anywhere in the world. Very, very large program, very complicated program, a couple of million lines long, and it's the only operating device that we have, for example, to model vaccines. All the rest of them are hand or paper and pencil models, whereas this one allows us to actually simulate real-world environments. And that's another matter that differentiates sort of the computational modeling approach from more standard social science approaches. We are interested in simulating what happens in the real world, so that we want to be able to recreate the behaviors, the actions, decision-making of people in the process of being able to use that as a platform for understanding alternative responses to it. You'll probably know that in the real world, the way the government works, it's not such that expertise or expert information arises and the government says, okay, we have a problem, we'll take this expertise or this information and put it into a policy. More often than not, we ignore the expertise. And so we want to sort of look at how and why that occurs. And the classic example that most of you are familiar with is in the climate change, where it's been very difficult to get this on the public agenda and keep it on the public agenda, not just in the United States. A similar problem we see in Britain, less so on the continent, but in the United States and Britain, it's a particularly interesting problem. So as I go through, I'm going to be mixing some information that we get from traditional social science approaches, and then also some of the insights that we get from the computational approach. I'll try to differentiate them, but they're sort of all mixed in here. So the starting point when we look at public policy is that the structure of governments and the structure of citizens do not permit large numbers of things to be on the policy agenda. That the public's ability to keep track of a large number of issues is quite limited. The media's ability to keep a variety of problems before the public is, again, quite limited. There's also, this is standard attention span problems. There's also a matter where the longer it's on the public agenda, the more bored we get. And unless there is some drama that's added to it, the chances are it will simply languish and fall off. Now, because the public agenda has a limited number, and think of this like books on a shelf. If my shelf can only hold 5 or 6 books, if I put another book on it, I'm going to knock one of them off. And that's essentially what happens with the policy agenda. In the United States, we typically, if you look at the way the polls come out, you typically never see more than 3 or 4 big sort of what are the problems facing America coming out. And that gives you a sense of what we're dealing with. We're very seldom going to have more than 4 or 5 major issues on the agenda, which means then that if something arises, something else is going to go off the agenda. And the question is, how do you get something like climate change on the agenda in a way that would allow us to make a policy response to it? And that turns out to be a much more difficult matter. The 2 things that can get you off the policy agenda are displacement. Somebody else is, some other issues come up, and so that's automatically going to knock something off. And secondly, the attention fatigue, that after a while, even if it remains a problem, you lose the public interest. Now, the problem is that not only do academics know that, but operatives know that. So that if I'm a political strategist, I know full well that that's the way this works. And if I want something off the agenda, one of the things I want to do is to force something else on it. And that's a standard thing that you see. And that's one of the types of sort of sub-games that we need to pay attention to if we're doing complex simulations of this entire process. We know that there are operatives that understand this process, understand that we're not going to be able to pay attention to this if I can get other things considered to be more important. And then if something is on the agenda, unless I'm good at drama, unless I'm good at keeping the matter fresh, it will eventually die simply by boredom or inattention. So these are all parts of what strategists, and the word that we use in public policy is operative. These are things that the operatives must take into account, and they do take them into account, particularly the shrewd ones. So as a standard matter, the policy regime at any one moment might think of as a status quo, and it's not a matter where all of these policies are all fixed. It means that you might be interested in climate, and so there's going to be a set of interests around that want a particular policy approach. You might be interested in national affairs or power projections, so there's going to be a set of interests around that. And what happens is that each sort of policy arena is captured by a set of interests. Very often, it's the interest that the policy itself creates. So if I create a particular set of policies on energy use, I'm also creating a set of interests now that want to keep that policy in place. So there's a lot of inertia to stay where you are once a policy is in place. And that's this second circle there. The capture operatives are those who say, we're enjoying the situation as it stands. Our interests are being fulfilled. We don't want to change. And so we're going to want the status quo. And if I'm a capture operative and I want the status quo, I do not want anything dealing with my policy back on the agenda, because that invites change. So if I'm a capture operative, I want things kept off the agenda. Now, what has been considered the single most important paper written in the last 50 years in political science talks about two phases of power, the ability to do something and the ability to prevent something from happening. And this second phase of power is what the capture operative is about. And that's why it's very difficult to move change, because by definition, whatever policy is in place has created a set of interests. Okay, the change operatives, on the other hand, are that outer circle. So we may have a conference report in 2007 that says, look, we've got a serious problem here. We've got to take some action on climate change. And we put some information into the pot that essentially says, look, here now we have an issue that we need to address, and there will be serious consequences. So it's now competing in two very different ways. It's competing against the capture operatives who want to keep things the way it was, and it's also competing for attention on the public radar. It's competing to try to get onto the agenda. To say the experts have concluded that is not enough to solve either of those two problems. And in fact, there are prejudices inside of cultures like the American culture which actually downplay expert opinion. And come to that toward the end. The process that I've been talking about then, that if we're going to be able to get a status quo onto the policy agenda so that we can look at it and perhaps change it, there's got to be a breakout where this balance between the capture operatives and the change operatives allow that second phase of power, that keeping something from happening, to break down. Now, there's a whole bunch of forces at work there. We can actually simulate that. It's really not magic, but it's not all that simple. But we do know something about breakout. It's not simple, and I'm going to show you some of the issues in a second. Once we break out, in other words, once I've said we can actually get this onto the agenda, there's a second problem that emerges, and that is that if you're going to get this on the agenda, you're going to want to describe the problem one way, and I'm going to try and describe it a different way. So now we're in the process of framing this issue. What's it all about? That if I'm a capture operative and I lose control so that it gets onto the agenda, my next step is to frame the issue so that you lose anyway. And there's a great book that was written in political science several years ago called Speaking Truth to Power. And the two of them are very often at odds. So we got the framing matter, and there you're going, and we're going to talk to you about some of that today. And then once the framing is done, then ultimately we're going to find out whether this languishes, whether it's pushed off, or whether you get some type of a change. Okay, so let's look at the public discourse. Because in countries like the United States and Great Britain, the public becomes part of what we mobilize to break the capture, to break the policy out of the hands that want it the old way. If it were the case that everybody operated on the same rules of evidence, we could communicate. We could say, here are the facts, here's what it means, here's the evidence, here's the proof. But that's not the way it works. And for 2,000 years now in the West, we've had actual multiple, particularly the first two, revelation and observation. These end up with very, very different rules of evidence. You're all familiar with them, say in the creationism evolution matter, where one set of rules of evidence derive from revealed truths, another set of rules derive from observation, and those two sit there and fight with one another. Well, it turns out that's been going on for a long, long time. There's a third one which I'm not implicitly going to, we will implicitly talk about, but I'm not going to go into today because it's actually way too complicated for a brief discussion, is social construction. This, you may run into people that use the word hermeneutic. Okay, this is the social construction issue. And then under this thing called hermeneutic, we have to make a division between whether or not it's a methodology for knowledge or a theory of being. It gets very interesting very quickly, but I'll just leave it at that. So the end result is that if we're claiming, or if our population claims to get its truth from different places, and therefore the rules of what constitutes evidence from different places, we're going to end up with competing explanations. And that makes the problem very difficult because an operative knows that. A capture operative knows that very well. And if you've looked at the press today, you can see it in operation. They're taking full advantage of it. But it's not just today. We've got examples going way back. That's what yellow journalism is. That I will deliberately construe certain things in ways that draw upon and appeal to, say, revelation as opposed to observation. Okay, there's another matter. The substitution one comes. We have learned a great deal about that from the computational simulations. And that is, not only do we have competition in the public over what the rules of evidence are, which relate in turn to the source of truth, but we also have an odd situation where, in the absence of information, we substitute an explanation. So, climate change, okay, I'm not going to read any of the papers, but I am going to talk to you about conspiracies. Okay, so now I bring in an explanation, and it becomes a substitute for the data. And you'll see in a minute that we discover that that is extremely important in making it difficult to get a policy decision. Okay, I won't spend time on this, but if you go back, look, 389 AD, this conflict between evidence from revelation and observation appears. It's not a new one, but you all have seen these types of things in your own day as well. The Galileo trial is a good example where the church is saying one thing, Galileo saying another thing, and Galileo ultimately lost. I mean, Western society won, but Galileo didn't. We have some of our own contributions here. the Puritan witch trials. The key there is whether or not we should be able to use extrasensory information to indict, convict, and execute people, which may strike you as being a bit primitive now. I mean, we did that. We killed 17 people in this particular witch hunt. But most of you have heard people worry about, oh, the courts aren't making the right decision on this particular criminal or whatever, and they're substituting essentially their own rules of evidence for the legal rules of evidence that would be accepted in today's court of law. That continues, and particularly when we get into the types of vigilantist logic, you're now essentially creating new rules. Scopes trials, another example, and we still deal with that one. And by the way, when you have, you may or may not know, but matters like the Scopes trial become quite important when you have textbook systems where the volume of textbooks that are used affect the content. And so if Illinois professors are free to choose a textbook, and if Massachusetts professors are free to choose a textbook, but Texas professors must all use the same textbook, and that textbook and its contents are determined by a committee that are not experts, you end up with the Texas variant of what is civil society, and because they have so many of those texts required, it now becomes a dominant, essentially a dominant textbook for the rest of the country. So you've got a committee deciding the content of what government does, and that then becomes the device by means of which we teach what government does. We have some very interesting issues there, and that right now is the case with government, the government texts. Yeah. Okay, in the substitution case, I don't want to use some of these odd terms, but this malevolent agent substitution, someone is always trying to take from me what is rightly mine. This is what we call a schema. That if I find somebody's general approach to things is somebody's always trying to take something from me. If that's part of my category of logic, I'm going to find this occurring in several different places. And so in terms of simulation, we can actually take this schema and predict in advance that there will be what we call logic maps. That if you hold the schema, I'm going to find these other logic maps. So I'm going to be able to, once I know that you hold the schema, I'm going to be able to tell your position on a lot of different issues, even though you don't see the similarity or the reason why. Becomes quite important for understanding how the did I go back? Oh, okay. The political man, who we are, is not economic man, despite the fact that a lot of my colleagues like to use rational choice modeling. It's not the way political decisions are made. And this is one of what would be called one of the potboiler findings. The number or the percent in these categories can change by society and by time. But the relative size of them are what's important here. And what that diagram tells you is that very few at the top, the ideologue is not used here in a bad sense, it's used here in a good sense. Ideologue in this case means somebody that has a sufficiently organized set of ideas that they can take in a large amount of information and have places to hang it on. And that's essentially what you do in each of your professional trainings. You have ways in which you organize your thoughts about a particular part of reality, and then you can organize the information that from accordingly. Well, same thing in politics, but it turns out that the number or the proportion of people who have usable frameworks, i.e. that can take in large amounts of information, process it, organize it, etc., are relatively small. And again, if you look at those top two categories, that's a very small proportion of the population. If you're a good liberal, you want these proportions to be larger. If you're a conservative, you know they're much smaller. So it doesn't matter. But the problem is, relatively speaking, these are small categories. Small numbers of people that have the mental organization to handle, say, a problem like where climate change fits into a public policy regime. That's a serious matter. What we don't have to worry about is the last group, the no-issue content. They're essentially so random. In other words, there's so little that can stick in there that their decision-making is on things that are secondary to the choice. And we used to see examples like this. I used to live in Minnesota, and on the local elections, if you had a Scandinavian name and your opponent was Polish, the Scandinavian would win, and you could predict with great, it's that middle group here, the group interests in the nature of the times, that become important, because that's the group for which ideas are being formed by others. That's the group for whom opinions are being made. And that's the group that's being fought over when it comes to policy agendas, getting something onto it, framing it, etc. And it is sizable. In this particular case, it's nearly 2/3 of the population. But even if it's half the population, that's enormous. Because it means then that a good portion of your public is not going to be a primary information seeker. They're not going to have a well-thought-out explanation of a problem. They're going to take the conclusions given to them or the explanations given to them by someone else. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look, Wall Street Journal and New York Times, very important papers. Wall Street Journal's daily circulation is only around 2 million. That's if you count the paid subscriptions on the electronic version. New York Times, only about 1 million. Now compare that to the 25, between 15 and 25 million, depending upon whose measure you're looking at, that apparently have some contact with Fox News. And there's a rather different content in those types of mechanisms. Okay. The framing matter then takes us to this odd little problem where the people at the top of that pyramid know that they are essentially going to be able to determine what the explanation or what the stories are or what the pictures that we have in our heads about a particular problem may be. And those in turn are sent out to opinion leaders, and it's the opinion leaders then that sort of communicate to the masses. Well, the operatives, we know that we look at the interests there. So if we want to know what they're going to do, why they're going to do it, we can go back and look at the interests, how they're tied into the policy subarenas, etc. Okay, and there we're come closest to sort of using rational interest. From that point on, however, the connection with rational interest gets much more tenuous. So that by the time we get to opinion leaders, people that I buy or hire to do newscasts or do the entertainment shows that pass for newscasts, etc. By the time I get to there, we can be quite away from quote-unquote rational interest, and the people at the bottom who are picking up sort of the tail of the story can end up making decisions that are against their interests and smile about it because they don't know. So, and that is directly related to this, this two sets of pyramids. We've got the operatives there, and we've got varying capacities to basically pay attention to political arenas. Now, in the climate change, the two general models that we've been seeing, the first one is the tobacco industry model that I'm going to create doubt about evidence. So if you haven't done that, you should, because it's quite instructive. So we get a report that 95% of scientists overall say that there's a climate change problem, and that most of those in turn think there's an anthropogenic component to it. What I want to do, if I'm using the tobacco industry model, is gnaw at the edges. That if I know that you're not fully aware of how science works, and I pick something that's actually quite marginal to the problem and tell you, see, there's a problem here. There's something going on here. This doesn't make sense. Therefore, all of it's wrong. And that's selling. You know, I nip and tuck at the edges and then say, okay, that's just a clear demonstration that there's a lie here. That typically happens. We saw that in the tobacco industry. And this was quite organized, as you know, from the lawsuits and all of that stuff that eventually came out, that the tobacco industry knew exactly what they were doing, knew exactly what types of scientific articles they had to attack. They would create their own science as necessary, but you kept that doubt, and as long as you can say, I'm not sure.
You don't think that they really believed it? That they're really sitting and we know this is killing people, we consciously have to manipulate this to keep our industry going? Is that what you're saying?
We have memos to that effect. That was testified in Congress. Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, and I'm not, you know, that's just, yeah, no, yes. The Hearst-Murdoch model is very interesting because this is the one where we take something that's complex like climate change, or take something complex like what causes cancer, and then I'm going to essentially substitute entirely for the science a different story. So you may all be familiar with, how many of you have heard of a guy named Fatty Arbuckle? Yeah. And the story that's astonishing. I mean, this man is a Hollywood very, very popular star, very fat, big guy. And so he throws a party at a hotel. One of the people accompanying one of his guests had had a backstreet abortion 2 days earlier. While she was at the party, she gets ill. They allow her to lay down in one of the rooms in the suite. She bleeds out and dies. So what the Hearst papers do is argue that Fatty Arbuckle raped her, and because he was so fat, he smashed her, and she bled out because of this salacious behavior. Didn't happen. Sold lots of newspapers. Got Arbuckle convicted. And it took years for the courts to realize that the newspapers convicted him, not the evidence. And by the time he's finally exonerated, you know, there's no career left here at all. And he then actually gets a job from Hearst, the very man who did this. And so he asks Hearst, why did you do this? And Hearst's response was, it's my job to sell newspapers. The Murdoch model, I mean, Murdoch is our modern Hearst, doing essentially the same. Now, the notion of yellow journalism, or what is yellow journalism, is really not new. I mean, this has been analyzed in the social sciences for over 100 years. And this is an important social scientist from University of Chicago back in 1908, commenting about how one uses yellow journalism. You know, that instead of doing the in-depth explanatory work that one might want, what one does instead is put a face on it. And if I can put a face on it, say, this person rags to riches, and therefore everybody can do it, I have done two things. I have trivialized the explanation, and I've invited you to generalize from an N of 1. So if I've invited you to fail to understand distributional qualities, and that little logical error then means that if I can get you to take this case as the story, that then compensates for any more complicated thing that might make you have to understand that, gee whiz, there's all sorts of distributional problems like, you know, capacities. Okay, so this is a logic map that we computationally built off of Rush Limbaugh. Okay? And Limbaugh has a reasonably large audience. And the story, and you can go back and look at the texts of the, they're online now. You can go back and actually look at the texts of the discussion that he had on this. But this is the story, that global warming is a man-made hoax, that this is all part of Washington's conspiracy to create a grand... I'm not making this up, I'm just taking this. This comes right out of the text. Washington is attempting to create a giant welfare state. It's also a conspiracy against capitalism, and among other things that are parsed out of here is that this is an attempt to take the wealth of America and give it to unworthy people elsewhere. So climate change policy is really an international redistributive conspiracy. Now, the interesting thing is, if you think back on that schema that I talked to you about a little bit ago, about somebody's always out to try to take my stuff, that's the schema that underlies this logic map. And it turns out that once you get the schema, I can tell you exactly how he'll describe poverty. I mean, without going to his text, I can tell you how he's going to describe it, how he's going to describe who the poor are and why they're poor. And then I'll go to the text and confirm. So that turns out to be rather interesting. So if we are looking at the policy decision process, what we've ultimately got here is we've got operatives that are doing framing. We got those that want to keep the status quo, those that want to get it changed. And they're fighting for this soft underbelly of the public. That soft underbelly that's not attentive to the explanations that would require, say, reading the mainstream journals. And then who the opinion leaders are. And this is why there's been such an interesting battle over control over certain types of media. And then ultimately, of course, results are seen in elections. Almost done. If we were to say, if that's the world that we're living in, and I think the evidence suggests that that's the world we're living in. it's not a nice picture. It's certainly not the one in the Texas textbooks. But if we were to simply say, look, there's expert information here, you ought to listen to it. There's cultural traditions that automatically undermine that. We have a long-standing anti-intellectual tradition in the United States. We also have something called a paranoid style. Both of these are described by a man named Richard Hofstadter, lots of other sources as well. But what these do is essentially demote the importance or relevance of expert knowledge. Okay, so it means that it does not have the type of status that it has on the continent, where Julius Benda writes this book, Betrayal of the Intellectuals, where the intellectuals have an obligation to make sure that these complex problems are brought to the public, etc. Here, bring them, the chances of somebody listening to you are not high. Similarly, we do not, if you rely upon the mainstream media, we've got now two 20-year studies, one done in the United States, one done on the papers in Britain, to see how climate change has been in and out of the papers. Okay, and there are different interpretations about why they've done it, but it has been quite sporadic and short bursts of time, and then it's dropped. In both of the papers in the U.S. and on mainstream papers. I'm not talking about the yellow journalism. Okay, if I were to take the knowledge that we're fighting for a soft middle, there's a couple of other things that we can do that sort of change the focus. One of them is to point out that we do live in an engineered world, and that any climate change is going to have an effect on what we engineered against. So that if I set up a floodplain that assumes something about 100-year floods, and the climate change is now making my old assumptions out of date, I've got a problem. These big dams or dikes or whatever, this Holland system, this big ocean system that's to control the flooding from the North Sea, the assumptions that they made when they put that in, they're now finding that it's being used 40% more already than was anticipated when it was designed. So if you get continued rise in those sea levels, you've got increased use of a system, and because of some wear and tear matters, that actually reduces its life expectancy as well. So we actually have a place of data, lots of things, lots of places where decisions have been made. And we've now come to understand that we need to revise the original assumptions. That's a piece of information. And you can blame, those guys back there must have been really dumb. Now we can get into, we have somebody to put a face on and blame. But it brings back to attention that if this isn't taken care of, there will be other costs. Venice, how long will that city exist? So that's one set, but it changes the orientation, and it focuses on stuff that we have ready information on, and it does not require that grand middle to understand the complex models that went into sort of understanding what happened in the first place, or what is happening. The national security one, just briefly, one of my students says, I only want to worry about things. I don't want my tax money to go to things that benefit me, and so I don't want to put money into climate change because it's just going to benefit third world people. Well, something happened to allow the world to have a carrying capacity of 6 billion people plus and growing. Now, if we remove some of the land because of climate change that they're eating on, don't expect them to just die and the population decrease. The standard thing that we always see is they're going to try and get somebody else's land. They're going to be moving. These are the standard things that create all of the social tensions. And because we live in something called a nation-state world, there is no way that it's not eventually going to touch American security. And there's absolutely no way in which it's not going to take your tax money. And so now the question is, what's the cheapest way of handling the problem? Do I wait until we have an international crisis that we're brought in because we've got warring factions that are trying to get a place to live? Or do we find a way where we can reduce that in advance? So I mean, that changes sort of the scope a little bit of the problem, but it's a way to communicate with the grand middle that is a bit more easy to understand in the schema, the way they typically interpret the world. Okay, so I think we're done. This last one is the okay. This last one is I wish this were my observation, but it is a standard observation. First proposed by Charles Lindblom 50 years ago. In countries like the United States and Great Britain, the test of a good policy is not that we agree on what it's going to do. It's just that we agree on the policy. So you can agree on the policy because you think it's going to do ABC. You can agree because you think it's going to do DFG. If we try to get ourselves to agree on what it's going to do, you actually minimize the chance that a policy change will occur. If a policy can do many different things, and then you simply let it at that level, the end result is you're in a better position to get a policy shift by letting people agree on the policy as opposed to why. Okay? And that goes back to our framing problem. So, okay, any questions I can try to answer? Go ahead. And then I'm supposed to try to repeat them, or I'll try to come close to you so that they get onto.
Loud enough. This is not a problem. My wife always tells me. So you mentioned that in some places in Europe, this is not so much of a problem. In Northern Europe, you look up Sweden. They have 80% atheists. It's observation versus revelation. So what do you make of this sort of correlation between their belief in God and the fact that they are taking observational data and acting on it in terms of climate change or doing something about it? How do you put those two
Well, we know historically that that's been quite important. A very simple matter, the United States, with the revolution of 1776, that separated the colonies from Great Britain, could not have occurred under the revelation doctrine. It occurred under an observation doctrine. It may sound strange, but you've got Jefferson saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Did you notice in there that there's no reference to God commanded? The reference here is that the work of God is writ large in the world around you. Remember Galileo up here? If God gave you 5 senses, you should be able to learn what God intends by looking. That's what Jefferson and Franklin, etc. did. The debate between, I don't want to go into a great deal of history, but when John Locke wrote the second treatise on government, there was the first treatise on government. Okay, and both of these two treatises are aimed against the claim of the divine right of kings. And among other things, the king used the fourth commandment, used some verses out of, I think, Matthew on how you're supposed to obey authorities, Matthew or Romans, one of the two. And so in the first treatise on government, Locke did like the king did. I'm going to use the Bible to show you Bible verses that say the king does not have divine right. And so then the king comes back with another commission that says, oh, no, here's some other Bible verses that show the king does have a divine right. First treatise on government, that's what it's about. Second treatise on government, shift entirely. I'm not going to use the scriptures as the fundamental source. I'm going to use the capacity that God gives man to observe as the fundamental source. And so then in the second treatise on government, we start talking about this mind as a blank slate where you come into a world and its structures and all this stuff are imprinted upon you. You have the worth and dignity to use your five senses. You don't need to have her tell you what they tell you. And since you also have the capacity for self-direction and self-development, you can use your God-given capacities to understand the world around you. And once I say that, I also say, shouldn't you be counted the same way I am in the calculus of power? That's essentially what happened. So, I mean, there are big areas. But remember, the people that are doing the Founding Fathers' work are not the same people who were running the Puritan churches in Massachusetts. Let's do this lady first. You can talk loud.
I talk very loud also. I want to thank you so much in the first part of your talk, in your description of the Champaign County Board. It was excellent. So this leads me to my serious question.
Oh, she's right.
Does your computational modeling lab focus on what is presently going to be a big issue, and that is, since the census is coming out, the redistricting, and what that will then do to decision making? This is a very important.
Yeah, there are a lot of political scientists that are work on that. I mean, that's been you don't really need our methods to. I mean, there's no question that's important. There's absolutely no question that's important. And there's absolutely no question that it will have an impact on policy at the local and national level. But there are much more standard tools that can be used to look at that. I mean, we know, the Supreme Court's decision essentially means that you're supposed to have equal districts. Okay, keep in mind, by the way, this is a relatively new thing in America. It's not. It wasn't until 1965 that we even required the districts to have roughly the same size of constituents. So, I mean, before 1965, it was perfectly legal in places like Tennessee for 90% of the representatives to speak for 10% of the people. But the court's decision about, how much leeway you can have, it's not all the same number. You can vary by actually a couple 100,000, I think, maybe actually more now. So you get some variation there. So you already have some way to vary the size of the number that you're putting in there. And now I have the ability to do my geographic mapping. We have every party now has broken down to the block or below. Some cases we have it down to the household, what the political choices have been. And what I want to do is I want to maximize the number of representatives I have by putting 50 plus one or two in there of whoever I want. And that's why you get some very strange boundaries, and it happens every 10 years. And if I have a group that I don't like, I'm going to make sure that a district has 95% of them in it. Okay, I know I have to give them some representation, but it's going to be one, and not proportionate to their representation of the population. That's and there's not likely. I mean, we can show you computationally optimal districts, but I don't know of a single case where a state has adopted an optimal district recommendation.
Well, set up a redistricting commission that's supposed to have that meeting. That's why I asked the question.
I'm going to bet. I'm just going to bet it's not going to quite work out that way. It's my theory. It's,
As part of that commission, I'm facing what we were just discussing. It is a unique situation.
I'm just shill.
That's my question to you is not necessarily a question but a comment. Do you think that what we're seeing now, for instance, a substitution of an explanation for expert fact, a perfect example would be Michelle Bachmann in Seitz, which, if anybody's heard her explanation of how slavery ended, it's so far removed from history and the facts, and yet that's the kind of substitution that's being made by many of that political persuasion. And yet there are a percentage of people, like you show, will believe that explanation.
yeah. My sister is in Michelle Bachmann's district, and it's always, it's a great fun to find out the construction of reality from my sister. Yeah, it doesn't correspond with most.
Continue to re-elect her. What is the makeup of that district? How is it made up based on your breakdown?
Well, it picks up a lot of the best to describe it, the rural churches, heavy portion there, and they're used to balance off part of St. Cloud, where you've got some mix. There is a college there, and sometimes those college students stray from the construction of Michelle Bachmann, so they're just balanced in a way. She's a very safe district, and what really should be troubling you is, it troubles me, that her constituents actually really believe she's talking the truth. And they're willing to trust her and not go and do any exploratory background. And I know that my sister's not dumb, but mine, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I think that's you, and then we'll come back to okay.
Yeah, it seems like the issue that comes up, whether we're talking about religion or something else, is if we have an opinion, we want to break down a group, we take the most extreme of that group, make the assumption that that opinion applies to the whole group. So if you're conservative, you might take the most outlandish liberal statement and say, well, all liberals believe this, and Democrats are all liberal, and so therefore all Democrats believe this. In religion, it's the same way. You get the fringe in religion that believe the world is 6,000 years old, and they come to represent all the religions, even though their theology is bad, let alone their...
We have to do, in computational modeling, we do two things. First of all, we have to look at all of the different types of maps. For example, there are actually 6 different operational logic maps for the word conservative in the United States. In other words, if somebody tells you they're conservative, there's actually 6 different logic maps. Liberals, 4. So what looks like a simple, you're either liberal or conservative, we know can't reduce to that. The problem with the fringes is that an operative can take advantage of that. And if they put money into it, you can elevate people to positions of authority or voice who, because of the trust of this soft middle, can do a great deal of construction or destruction. But yeah. Oh, let's do you, and then we'll come. Okay.
So, experts on all kinds of topics, like climate change, for example, having difficulty keeping it as an important policy, keeping on the agenda. but they're coming from the same institutions as people who understand how things how things work, how policy works. They understand the same things that the operatives work.
Absolutely.
They understand that
Oh, we have to be. Hopefully, the academics are one step ahead of the operatives, because if we can't stay one step ahead,
right.
I guarantee you, democracy will be in name only.
Well, right. So then, what's the gap? Why are the experts in say climate change or other issues not able to work with their counterparts and keep things on the agenda?
Part of that's just the intellectual division of labor. I mean, how often, if you're worried about climate change, how often do you talk to social scientists? We're still, I had this conversation with Don Lubbles, and I tried to say, look, I have to be able to have a correct logic map of the scientific story of climate change. He said, oh, no, you're stepping outside of your area of expertise. I said, no, if I don't have that in the machine, I have no baseline against which to compare its distortions. And that took a while just to sort of get and understand. These are not divisionary. I mean, that expertise you have may be relevant and may be required to be built into, in our case, the simulations. We absolutely have to have that as part of the framework. And I mean, Don's position was not really unusual. I mean, there's areas of expertise. Let those people handle it. And no, now it's time to talk.
So you've done a brilliant job of laying out the problem. How do we, what's the solution? How do we move beyond into a policy that actually takes us into beginning to address some of these problems that are being obfuscated or with misinformation?
First of all, we have to assume that that won't.
We assume it to happen. So now how do we overcome it?
And so then my dad has a phrase, which is somebody has to be smarter than the dog. That if you know where this is going, we have to take that into account as the baseline. That's actually why we try to get these simulations. We want to reproduce the world so that then we can introduce in there an alternative and see how it sort of works through the system. This is essentially what we do in the AIDS program as well. We had huge amounts of trouble trying to get certain parts of this problem onto the agenda. How this was. Talk about misperceptions and reconstructions of reality. If I assume that you're infected because this is God's wrath, that's your problem, and there's no public money, there's some interesting issues there. One of the things I did at the end is there are ways to sort of get around. If we know how they're doing it, and if we know what their schema is, can I use the same schema? If you're worried that somebody's always out to take your money, maybe I can talk to you about, national security problem, they're going to be taking your money. Now, do you want to sit by and let it happen since you're worried about keeping your money, or should we try and reduce that? So then we turn it into a problem of what's the way to minimize the cost. And now you're back on, now you open up the arena of fixes.
Did you hear David Orr speak last night or yesterday or this morning? He was talking about, first climate change is the subject around sustainability, and then it went to the economy, and now he's taking it to a national strategic issue.
Yeah, and that's
security issue.
That is when I was doing, because we ended up working with 13 agencies, including the intelligence agencies, on the AIDS problem. And so we were at these meetings all the time. And the only time it finally caught on to them that there might be a problem is when we showed them the simulations of what would happen if you if through death, a large proportion of the productive part of certain communities died. Because AIDS, unlike childhood diseases, kills productive adults. And that means that if you've got children, you're going to have orphans. If you've got older people who can't support themselves, et cetera. And societies just don't sit back and say, okay, we lost. You know, there are other things that are done, and those other things have ripple effects. And that's where you start ultimately getting attention. That the appeal to social justice goes nowhere. I mean, at the UN it goes, yeah. At the UN it does. National security goes much further. And in part because now you're talking their language. You're using their schema, et cetera. There's one other. As we get, we've learned a great deal about too much about how people construct reality. And in others, I mean, there is an art that can be taught, and the operatives do this. And as we try to study how they're doing it, so that we can be one step ahead, you have people like the senator from South Carolina who wants to end all of that research. I don't know why. You want me to say that one again? There have been I forget his name. I keep repressing it, but he actually introduced a bill to remove political science, all political science funding from the National Science Foundation. For example, Bachman, of course, would remove most of the National Science Foundation because we don't need these experts being supported with whatever. Okay.
Lines of even just mobilizing. I'm loosely involved with a group that meets on a night that I can almost never go to that talks about electric vehicles in town and promoting electric vehicles. And it's interesting how that's an area where you get environmentalists together and maybe starting it, and then you get people that are gearheads that are kind of interested in the topic that come. You get some engineers that come together, and you get people that come in with a really conservative slant that are interested in the national security. So as these other topics start feeding in, it's interesting how that group grows and is more diverse. And it's not just some environmentalists sitting around talking about the little bicycle cars. It's an interesting group that starts to talk about different issues and different topics and brings in support.